Okay, today we're looking into chapter 15, section number 2, which is about the civilizations of West Africa. And so today we're going to be taking a look at Ghana, we're going to look at Mali, we're going to look at an old African empire called the Songhai, and then we'll get into some of the later kingdoms that came into play around the 1400s and 1500s as well. Let's start with Ghana. Ghana was a kingdom that came into a power around 700 after creating a lot of wealth from basically taxing the goods that traders would carry through their territory. So they kind of acted as a middleman, and they utilized taxation heavily to basically come up with ways to gather wealth off of people coming through their territory. It's almost like charging to travel through, so on and so forth, kind of like a modern turnpike system that's utilized in some of the states here in the United States. One of the things that you have to take into account is that Ghana was located in West Africa. So I'll show you the map really quick here. Basically, when you're looking at Ghana, talking about really when they're flourishing would be around 1000 AD. But Ghana is basically this yellow circle right here. Okay. These are some of the major areas that Ghana controlled right in that region there. Okay. Next, we will go into talking a little bit about what the people there did. And one of the most famous things that you're going to want to know about is called the gold salt trade. Now, the gold salt trade, these were the two most important trade items in West Africa. Gold came from the forest region of the savannah. It was located mostly between the Niger and Senegal rivers. Now, you can get gold in a couple ways. You can pan it in a river and sift it out with a sifter, but you can also dig down deep to find gold as well. So there's a couple of ways that you can mine for it. Most of the world's gold at this time came from this region of Africa. It's still one of the places where gold is found most often. However, one thing that West Africa lacked was salt. An abundance of salt was actually located in the Sahara Desert. So these Berbers who were from North Africa, we sort of learned about them in section 1, they began to trade by using camels, okay? A horse, an oxen, other animals, they don't really travel very well, okay, across the desert. They're not going to make it. But a camel can go without water for, I think, close to about 2 weeks. So the camel could cross the desert, and then they could trade for salt, cloth, weapons, and manufactured goods. Gold was traded for salt in exchange in many cases, and that's why it's called the gold salt trade. It was very common in this part of the world, and of course during this time period. Trade was closely monitored, though, by royal officials in the savannah kingdoms. So when you were doing this trade, they were making sure that everything was going well, making sure that everything was going in their favor. And the kings would mandate that these royal officials would be out there to make sure that the trade was working appropriately. So there was some organization to this whole scheme. Next is going to talk about this region as being known as the land of gold. The kings of Ghana controlled trade and created large armies. They generally would force the surrounding chiefs to pay them tribute in the form of gold and salt, and they would basically accumulate this wealth and accumulate this salt for storage. The king would then limit the distribution of the gold to keep its value high. Remember that something is only valuable because it is rare. Once it becomes less rare, it's no longer valuable. With this wealth and power now, these kings of Ghana would rule as religious leaders, chief judges, and also military commanders. So their efforts were a little bit widespread. Eventually, there's going to be some Islamic influence on this region. South of the Sahara, okay, the Islamic faith mostly spread through trade. In other regions of Africa, it spread through conquest, but in this part, it's mostly through trade. Muslim merchants and then also teachers would often settle in these areas south of Sahara, and then they would begin to spread their faith. Eventually, the rulers of Ghana would convert to Islam, but many people in the kingdom continue to practice that old African faith that we talked about in class several times this year called animism. Eventually, a group called the Almoravids from North Africa that we learned about in section 1 would conquer Ghana. Roman numeral 2 is going to talk about the next kingdom that we're going to take a look at. That's called the Empire of Mali. Really, it's more of an empire than a kingdom. I misspoke there, but nonetheless, a lot of these empires did have kings. Mali was another West African empire. It flourished from 1235 into the mid 1400s, and it also grew rich from trade. Miners there began to discover new gold deposits to the east, and this shifted trade routes to the south and to the east, which actually benefited the people of Mali. I'm going to show you on this map here where Mali was located. Okay, Mali kind of coming into play like 1235, but lasting into the 1400s. This is Mali around 1400. One of the famous cities, Timbuktu. You probably have heard of that city before. Also, Genève is still in that region there. But Mali is a very, very powerful empire. Had some really powerful individuals, too, that were a part of it. So we'll take a look at that next. Okay, one of the informational points to that, we want to talk about this guy, Sundiata. Sundiata conquers and creates an empire. Okay, so what we're going to take a look at here is that Sundiata was known as Mali's first great leader, which also is called a Mansa. A Mansa is the emperor of Mali, and he conquered the region of Ghana and then the trading cities of Kumbi and Walata. He then created a new capital city at Niani. That was the name of the capital city of Mali for quite some time. The empire actually under Sundiata began to have some peace and focused on agricultural produce. They also reestablished what I taught you earlier, the gold salt trade, and Niani became a center of trade for a larger region in Africa. Sundiata eventually died in 1255, but after him, a great ruler that is well known in world history, which I can guarantee you, if you're in the AP class on the AP exam, there's going to be a couple of questions about Mansa Musa. After Sundiata died, rulers of Mali then converted to Islam. Eventually, one of these Muslim holy men became the ruler. That was Mansa Musa. He's believed to be Sundiata's grand nephew. He ruled Mali from 1312 to 1332. He was known as a skilled military ruler. He expanded the gold salt trade and created a 100,000 man army. That's very large, especially for this region of Africa being rather early blossoming and starting to develop civilization. That's a very large army in the world at that time. He created an empire that was actually double the size of Ghana, as you saw on the map, and divided it into provinces that were ruled by governors. So this goes back to, even the Persians, how they governed with, provinces and satraps. That's, those are provinces and governors. That's basically a system that's been used for quite some time successfully in the Arabian Peninsula and also in Africa. What's interesting about Mansa Musa is he traveled on a Hajj or pilgrimage to Mecca from 1324 to 1325. And when he returned from that Hajj, he started to commission the building of mosques and universities. He also started to establish and build cities. And Timbuktu was established as a major city of trade where Muslim judges, doctors, religious leaders, and other scholars would flock to the city. Now, I'll tell you, if you study Mansa Musa is pretty cool character. He's known to be really wealthy, one of the most wealthy people in the history of the world. And he's always depicted with gold. And basically some of the pictures and drawings that you'll see of Mansa Musa are basically him like throwing gold at people and having large gold necklaces. So I would say he was definitely a baller of his age. And, in my class, we like to call some of the key figures key baller, but Mansa Musa seemed to be one of those type of figures who were always decked out in gold and other great costumes that were, really intricate. And it's kind of interesting to study him. But I can guarantee you, knowing about Mansa Musa will help you on the AP exam. Next, we'll talk about the travels of Ibn Battuta. Ibn Battuta was a traveling historian from the Tangier region of North Africa. And he traveled for about 27 years. He visited most of the Islamic countries throughout the entire world. Eventually, he did stop in Mali, and he wrote an account of the religious, social, and law systems of that great empire. He said a lot of positive things, but he also had some critiques of Mali. He said, yeah, they were doing a pretty good job about, spreading the faith, but he also didn't think that they were following all the rules and laws of Sharia all that appropriately. So you can see some of the primary source documents that he wrote and you can study them. After Mansa Musa, though, the empire began to weaken. Next, we'll take a look at the empire known as Songhai. The Songhai Empire had been under the control of Mali. Eventually, it separated and became a powerful trading group near the Niger River in the region of Gao. One of the famous rulers there was Sunni Ali or Sunni Ali. He was known as a conquering hero. He was a Muslim. He was ruler of Songhai starting in 1464. He built a professional army that had also a naval fleet, which was made up of war canoes, and he had a special cavalry also, which, as we know, are soldiers on horseback. In 1468, he captured the famous city of Timbuktu, and then in 1473, he captured the city of Genet, which we know as Genet, and then eventually married the Queen of Genet. He eventually died in 1492, which is a famous year of what was going on in the world at the time, and was possibly believed to be assassinated by a relative of his. The next in line was going to be his son, but then Aksia Muhammad eventually took over. So we'll talk about that. Number one was that Sunni Ali's son became the next ruler of Songhai. He was overthrown in a revolt by Aksia Muhammad. Aksia Muhammad added to the centralized government created by Sunni Ali. Eventually, the Songhai were invaded by an army from North African Morocco, and the Moroccans came in and took them over. The reason why they won is because that Songhai had only iron swords and spears. They were defeated by the Moroccans, who by this time had utilized gunpowder to use guns in 1591. So guns were on the map, and they were making big plays against some of these groups that did not have gunpowder. Okay, next we'll talk quickly about some of the other peoples of West Africa, some other groups, a little bit smaller, but still something that we want to know about. The Hausa. The Hausa were West African people. They lived in city-states in what is now northern Nigeria. They are actually named after their language, so the Hausa is actually a language. Some of the key city-states that you will read about in the text were Kano, Katsina, and Zazu, which is also known today as Zaria. They became major trading centers. Zazu became a center of trade for slaves, though, and they would trade the slaves for horse and also guns. Most of the city-states were actually surrounded by stone walls, and some slaves were used to repair and construct these city walls. One famous ruler from Zaza was actually a female named Queen Amina. She was actually a female who was an influential military leader. There's an insert box about her on page 418. We'll probably take a look at that at the end of today's lesson. Infighting, though, between the city-states of Hausa really didn't allow them to ever develop a strong, unified empire. So they were weakened by that infighting and lack of unity. Next, we'll talk about the Kingdom of Yoruba, which is a West African kingdom in what is now known as Benin and southern Nigeria. Eventually, Yoruba started to create several kingdoms that were controlled by independent kings. Mostly, they were based on farming, and the kingdoms of Ife and Oyo were the largest. One interesting point that I want to talk about with Yoruba is that most of these cities there had artists that would create terracotta and also metal cast sculptures. I'm going to show you some examples of these here at the end of the lesson. And then finally, Benin. It's a kingdom established near the delta of the Niger River. Cities there in the Benin kingdom were well organized with stone defense walls and narrow streets that were lined with homes and buildings along the sides. So very well organized. Like the Yoruba artists, the Benin created sculptures of bronze, brass, and copper. Your book does a really good job of showing you how these were made, and we'll take a look at that here momentarily. In the 1480s, though, key point here, the Portuguese traders began to show up in the ports of Benin, and they traded for pepper, leopard skins, ivory, and also slaves. This actually is when the centuries of European interference in Africa begins, and the Portuguese start the Atlantic slave trade. This is the first instance that we have in history of European groups coming in and trading for slaves in Africa. And then what they would do is they would take those slaves eventually to the Americas and other parts of the Atlantic region. And that's why it's called the Atlantic slave trade. So this is when that sort of starts in history. It's right around this time with these groups that we're learning about here. Okay, I want to take you to a couple of interesting things. Here's Songhai. You can see that Songhai, like we talked, was pretty large right here, and it ruled quite a bit of territory. Okay, next we'll go on down to talking about Mansa Musa. It says that Mansa Musa was the strongest of Sundiata's successors. He was a devout Muslim. On his Hajj, Mansa Musa stopped in Cairo, Egypt. 500 slaves, each carrying a staff of gold, arrived first. They were then followed by 80 camels, each carrying 300 pounds of gold dust. Hundreds of other camels brought supplies. Thousands of servants and officials completed the procession. Mansa Musa gave away so much gold in Cairo that the value of the precious metal declined in Egypt for 12 years. That's how wealthy this guy was. Now, it's not good that he had slaves. Okay, we can't say that that's a good thing. But the idea here is that he was super wealthy, one of the wealthiest people in the world. So there's some good and there's some bad. Okay, no doubt about that. All right, next, let's go ahead down here. Here's also Mansa Musa. You can see that any picture that depicts Mansa Musa has always got gold. Like I said earlier, here's a big chunk of gold in his hand, gold crown, so on and so forth. Okay, down here, all right, it talks about Queen Amina. We mentioned Queen Amina and how she was a military ruler, so it has a little bit of some of the things areas that she conquered and how she forced different groups to pay her tribute. Okay, which is very impressive. This is a Yoruba crown. This would be worn by the ruler. Okay, so you can see that artistry, like we had talked about, was very prominent in this part of Africa. This is an example of a mask. This is an ivory mask. So it's made out of ivory tusks. It was from the Kingdom of Benin in 1897. Okay. Now, we're going to talk about how some of these things, these are the bronze sculptures of Benin. Check this out. Look at that. That's a pretty intricate bronze sculpture there and statue. You can see here we've got some plaques. Interesting African art right there. This area is well known for the artwork. These are the folks that would wear the rings around the neck and would extend the neck into different lengths. Okay. Here we have this process of making the Benin sculptures. It's called the lost wax process. There's a lot to do with this. So basically, it starts out with a core, roughly the shape of the planned sculpture. Then the artist then applies a layer of wax over the core, then carves fine details into the wax. A layer of fine clay is then spread over the wax surface, and this creates a nice smooth finish and captures the small details which show through. Several layers of coarse clay are applied to the mold, and then the entire object is then put into a kiln or oven. The clay hardens and the wax melts away, which leaves a clay mold, and the melted wax is the origin of the name lost wax, because that's where it melts away. Then what happens is you melt bronze and it's poured into the mold and it's left to harden. And then the clay mold is broken off, revealing the finished inside bronze sculpture. So this is how it was made. This is how it was done. Those are the steps. Here's some other examples right here. There's a leopard, and over here is a musician playing some type of instrument there. So that's an interesting couple of pages, 420 and 421 in your textbook there, about making these bronze sculptures and statues. Thank you. Next, we'll be on to chapter 15, section 3, which is going to take us to the eastern part of Africa. Great Zimbabwe, the famous city there, will be one of the major focal points.